Welcome. In our last lecture, we offered a typology of environments on the African continent. Primary or major environments like tropical rainforest, desert, above all perhaps savanna. Secondary environments like lacustrine or riverine. In this lecture, our object is to add specificity to this general discussion of African environments, and frankly and simply to enjoy an imaginary tour of some of the great places, not just in Africa, but on the planet. In a number of our coming lectures, we're going to be dealing with very serious topics indeed, so this one, more than any other perhaps, is for fun. Our itinerary calls for us to begin at the southwestern tip of the continent, and then to move in a roughly counterclockwise fashion towards the north and east first, then wheeling west before turning south again, and ending at Victoria Falls, one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. Now, if, as we suggested in the last lecture, Africa, but especially Southern Africa, can evoke comparison with the North American West, it's possible to narrow and sharpen that analogy. The modern country of South Africa, like the Western American state of California, packs an astonishing variety of scenery into one place. Both provide us great mountains and great deserts, rugged, spectacular seacoasts, as well as broad, sandy beaches, sun-drenched wine country, and protected bays where great cities arose, Cape Town and San Francisco. Just how striking is the country of South Africa? As Alan Paton's narrator on the first page of his famous novel, Cry the Beloved Country, puts it, it's a land beyond the singing of it. Okay, Cape Town, the Cape of Good Hope, the Cape of Storms, the fairest cape of all, as one mariner put it. All of those terms direct us to the extreme southwestern corner of the African continent. The Cape region was home for many thousands of years to foraging and pastoralist peoples whom we will meet again beginning in our next lecture. And of course, this is also the place where South African history took a sharp turn, for it was here that the Dutch and later the English began their colonial enterprises in Africa. All that is coming as well. There's nothing quite like flying into Cape Town. The combination of ocean, mountain, and city is breathtaking. Commanding Table Bay and the city of Cape Town is Table Mountain. San Francisco, of course, is known for its hills. That city so similar in its origins to Cape Town in that both are located on protective bays along rugged shorelines. San Francisco known for its hills. But Table Mountain, at 3,556 feet, about the same height as the Blue Ridge in the Shenandoah National Park, and right next to this city, represents another order of magnitude. The actual Cape of Good Hope, considered to be the place where the cold waters of the Atlantic and the warmer ones of the Indian Ocean meet, lies actually south of Cape Town, the city, at the southern end of the Cape Peninsula. A steep, rocky, very narrow, and utterly spectacular finger of land stretching for about 30 miles south of Cape Town. Driving the highway to the tip of the Cape Peninsula is a bit like going on Highway 101 in California. That notion of the sea dropping off directly below you, the cliffs directly above you. You've probably seen it in movies with cars teetering on the brink of the abyss, if you have not driven it yourself. If you take that drive to the tip of the Cape Peninsula to the actual Cape of Good Hope on a windswept day, you'll quickly see why this was known originally as the Cape of Storms. And of course, the hope in Cape of Good Hope represented the hope for safe passage on the part of so many sailors. A vain hope, as the history of shipwrecks shows in southern Africa. And you realize again why the protection of Table Bay was so welcome. The immediate hinterland of Cape Town, the Cape Basin, or the Bowland, is South Africa's classic wine country. It's well described as Mediterranean in its climate, and there are good reasons for that. If you look at the map of Africa as a whole, you can see that the latitude in the southern hemisphere of Cape Town, the Cape region immediately adjoining Cape Town, is approximately the same southward latitude as the Mediterranean shore of North Africa is if one went north. In any case, if your idea of a good time is a meander through Napa or Sonoma valleys in California, believe me, this region, so nearby Cape Town, is for you. Cross over the various mountains. It's not a single range creating that basin or bowl, but cross through those mountain passes leading northward or northeastward from the Cape Basin, and you will enter rather suddenly, in the space of 30 miles or so, the Platteland. Platteland, an Afrikaans word, Afrikaans, the Dutch-descended language, means simply the flatland, although once you're in it, you'll see that it's intersected and interrupted by a number of quite vivid rises. This is the arid outback of the Cape and the South African interior. Pushed to the north, and the drier it gets. You're approaching the deserts of the Kalahari or the Kalahari and the Namib. You talk about big sky country in the American West. This is spectacular, overwhelming, gigantic. It's big sky capitalized. Now suppose we took a different route, not north or northeast, but straight east of Cape Town, and we would find ourselves on the so-called Garden Route and encounter the Fynbos or Fine Bush Floral Kingdom, one of only 6 such floral kingdoms designated in the entire world. The proliferation of plants and flowers is incredible. The Floral Kingdom really starts at Table Mountain itself, and if you take the cable car up Table Mountain, your brochure points out that there are more plant species on the slopes of Table Mountain than in the entire British Isles. Continue east along this garden route, along the southern African coastline of South Africa, and again the California comparison arises. Places like Tsitsikamma, sitting at the evocatively named Storms River mouth, is very comparable to places like Big Sur or Malibu along the California coast. If we continue eastward even further, we cross the Kai River into the region of South Africa known, simply enough, as the Transkei. This is Nelson Mandela's home country, and on the first page of his book, he's at some pains to tell us what he thinks of its appearance. In Mandela's words, "It is a beautiful country of rolling hills, fertile valleys, and 1,000 rivers and streams, which keep the landscape green even in winter. The Transkei alone is as large as the country of Switzerland." Our last stop in South Africa is one of Africa's great mountain ranges. The Zulu peoples, whose home territory is bounded on the west by the range, called it Ukahlamba, the barrier of spears. The immigrant Dutch-descended Afrikaners, or Boers, speaking the language I just mentioned, Afrikaans, called it the Drakensberg, or the Dragon Mountains. Both of these terms describe the spiked peaks which run for hundreds of miles southwest to northeast. Largely treeless, the rocks and grasses give off a reddish gold glow in winter, particularly from the eastern side as the morning light hits it. When the summer rains come, as in so many parts of Africa, the seasonal rainfall, those rains paint the Drakensberg with a patina of soft green. Well, let us leap north now to the heart of East Africa. This is truly out of Africa country. Indeed, Meryl Streep, who of course starred in that in that motion picture, I was looking at Robert Caputo's book of extraordinary photographs about Kenya, and she'd contributed a jacket blurb to this book, in which he spoke of Kenya's overwhelming beauty. She says that his book, quote, gave shape and color to the dreams I still have of this unforgettable land. Among the many people hooked by Kenya, Richard Leakey was born and raised in Kenya. He's the son of two great paleontologists who became a great paleontologist himself, and we'll meet him in the next lecture. Similarly, describes Kenya on this for this same book as a place of, quote, extraordinary array of contrasting and awesome country. Now, Kenya and South Africa may indeed be the jewels in terms of scenery in Africa, but as my son might put it, you can go nearby Kenya to Tanzania, Uganda, Malawi, places like that. As he might put it, they're not too shabby either. And Leakey's right. East Africa, like California, like South Africa, packs a great deal of contrast into a single region. Besides the warm beaches washed by the Indian Ocean, which are home to the Swahili cultures we'll examine the long history of in lecture number 11, there are considerable stretches of savanna, and many of East Africa's notable features are related to the tectonic plate disturbance in the Earth's surface that we call the Great Rift. Now, the Great Rift runs essentially north to south along the eastern semi-interior of the African continent. Some people have referred to it as the spine of Africa. On one hand, the rift created a gigantic gash running down the so-called spine of the continent. The dry portions of that gash, if you like, have created the Great Rift Valley, which runs in Kenya and northern Tanzania, home of one of Africa's most legendary peoples, the quite pastoralist, historically, Maasai peoples of East Africa. Now, when parts of this depression are filled with water, they can create either, in the case of the northernmost one, filled with ocean water, the Red Sea, or further south can give us some of Africa's so-called Great Lakes, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Malawi, and so forth, freshwater versions of the Great Rift activity. A place like Lake Malawi, I would describe essentially as a sort of Hawaii with fresh water. For a long time, the tourist industry of Malawi advertised this as not only drop-dead gorgeous, if I can use more of my son's lingo, but as a place that was, for reasons I don't entirely understand, free of two reasons you might not want to get in the water: crocodiles on one hand, and bilharzia or schistosomiasis, which is a debilitating disease found in a lot, particularly of settled water in East Africa. Now, in fact, both of these things have apparently cropped up. As you can imagine, they're not too happy in the tourist bureaus of Malawi, but an extraordinary place. There's something like 200 species of fish which occur only in Lake Malawi. Many of them are not just technicolor, they're almost psychedelic in their appearance. And I encounter undergraduates who are aquarium buffs and tell me that they get some of their most spectacular species originally from Lake Malawi, marketed across the world. Now, on the other hand, the rift is associated with crust uplift and with volcanic activity, both creating mountains, either mountain ranges like the Mountains of the Moon in Uganda, or standalone volcanic peaks like Mounts Kilimanjaro or Kenya. In the last lecture, we spoke of the way that elevation counteracts latitude in determining temperature. And indeed, these two great mountains are, as I mentioned at that point, quite snow-packed on top. Ernest Hemingway titled his famous story, later they made a movie out of that, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and he was right. His description of that has always stuck with me. Great, high, and unbelievable white in the sun was the square top of Kilimanjaro. Kilimanjaro is the tallest freestanding mountain in the world. By that I mean it's not part of a range. It is a gigantic volcanic cone, in essence, 50 miles in diameter. The soil, because of its volcanic origins, is unusually fertile, and I've been told that something on the order of 1 million people live just on the lower slopes of this mountain. Now, for visitors, probably the best of all is you can climb Kilimanjaro. I did it, and if I can do it, there's a very good chance that you can do it. It's no walk on the beach, obviously. Things like altitude sickness have to be taken seriously. If you go through it, you traverse several worlds on one major hike. When I say that you can do it, I mean that it's not a technical climb. You go through the lower slopes covered with maize, bananas, and coffee. You enter into a kind of montane forest, quite thick above that. Then the tree line is met and grassland kicks in. Rocky moors, tarns, small lakes up at the top, and then finally to that snow and ice on top. Although, as I mentioned last time, associated by many with global warming, apparently the snow and ice pack on the top of Kilimanjaro is shrinking at a rate alarming to some. Everest for every man is what one travel writer called Kilimanjaro, a phrase I rather like. Now, if we move move west at this point from East Africa, from Tanzania, from Kenya and so forth, we encounter Africa's great equatorial rainforests. Second largest rainforest in the world is the Congo Basin rainforest, following only the Amazon, very much in the center of the continent, and then a belt of forest which extends further west from there, stretching across the coastal strip of West Africa. This equatorial rainforest. When Joseph Conrad wrote The Heart of Darkness, he was writing largely about the darkness in the human and not necessarily the African human heart, and not the natural environment, but it's probably not accidental that he said it here in this forbidding expanse of forest. Let me give you another description of these equatorial rainforests from John Reeder, whose book, Africa, A Biography of the Continent, is much recommended. The tropical rainforest has an aura of still, silent, unfathomable power. Massive trees, huge living things crowned with a tracery of green, flickers of sunlight, a tangle of undergrowth, soft, damp, decaying leaf mold underfoot. Once among the trees, perceptions of distance are frustrated. A sense of direction is hard to maintain. Location is difficult to establish. People are quickly disoriented, lost, and not only in the physical sense. The close, absolute self-sufficiency of the forest also confuses the human sense of purpose and self-esteem. The forest is alive and growing and all-encompassing. It appears to extend forever and seems capable of living forever. Primeval and eternally recycling its beneficence. Well, as I say, if you continue that westward movement out of the Great Congo Basin, but continue in the forest belt along the West African coastal line, you, of course, have come to the West African subcontinent. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to a far better writer than I, and that is probably Africa's most famous writer in the outside world. I'm referring to the Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe. Still with us. His last great book, which is a masterpiece, was titled Anthills of the Savanna, which I'll explain the title of in a moment. But towards the end of that book, Achebe's hero is on the run. By the way, if you've read any of Achebe's novels, you know they're set in these fictional countries, but hey, anybody knows that it's Nigeria that he's writing about, his home country. His hero's on the run for political reasons. He's got to get out of town, he's in disguise and so forth, and he undertakes a bus journey. He figures that'll be safer. And his narrator here, Achebe's narrator, describes his journey essentially from south to north through some of these zones of the West African subcontinent. Let me give it to you from Achebe. The impenetrable rainforests of the south, through which even the great highways snaked like a mere game track, began to yield ground most grudgingly at first, but in time a little more willingly to less prodigious growths. And a couple of 100 kilometers further north, unbelievably, to open parklands of grass and stunted trees. The traveler's spirits rose in step with this diminution of forests, which gave the eye a heady facility to roam freely and take in the wide panoramas of space stretching to a horizon where tiny trees on distant hills and against clear skies form miniature Japanese gardens. His hero continues further north, and he's really getting now into very dry country indeed. Beyond that dried up river, there was hardly a yard of transition. You drove straight into a scrubland which 2 years without rain had virtually turned to desert. Desertification again. The air current blowing into the bus seemed to be fanned from a furnace. The only green things around now were the formidably spiked cactus, serving as shelter around desolate clusters of huts, and once in a while in the dusty fields, a fat-bottomed baobab tree so strange in appearance that one could easily believe the story that elephants looking for water, when they still roamed these parts, would pierce the crusty bark of the baobab with their tusk and suck the juices stored in the years of rain by the tree inside its monumental bowl. I mentioned that I would explain the title of Anthills of the Savanna. At one point, Achebe's narrator writes that this was like anthills surviving to tell the new grass of the savanna about last year's brush fires. He's really making a point about reminiscence, which is one of Achebe's great themes. Reminiscence by the old, filling in the young on history and what has transpired. Let me just flesh out Achebe's description a little bit. We started with that coastal belt. We moved into West Africa's Great Savanna Belt, running east to west. Some terminology here. Sudan obviously refers to a modern country in northeastern Africa. But Sudan in the larger sense, in the historical sense, is the belt of savanna stretching east and west across a huge section of west and indeed all the way over to northeastern Africa. Bilad al-Sudan, Arabic for land of the blacks, is where the term comes from. It's, a traverse of the West African Sudan would be like driving across Kansas times 10 without an interstate. Big sky country. Between the Sahara between the Savannah and the Sahara, if we're moving south to north, there's a strip there of semi-desert, again, terminology. The Sahel. This comes from the Arabic word for shore, and it refers to the southern shore, if you like, of a great ocean of sand, the Sahara. As the Sahara expands, by definition, the Sahel and the Savannah shift southward too. And finally, of course, we do enter into the vastness of the world's greatest, but as we specified last time, also its youngest desert. I'm going to end by moving to one of the wonders of the earth. It's official. It is one of the 7 natural wonders of the earth, and that's Victoria Falls on the Zambezi. In my mind, this is the greatest place on earth. It's quite a journalistic fad these days to issue these lists of things to do before you die. And that's the one that I might suggest you put on your list if you're so inclined to construct such a list. I'm not making this up. In my will, I ask for my ashes to be thrown over Victoria Falls. Whether anybody will bother is another question, but it has that sort of effect. Now let me set the scene here a bit. The Zambezi River, just upstream from the falls, is about a mile wide. So we have this mile-wide river flowing through islands and so forth. It then falls over and into a very steep and narrow trough over 300 feet deep. So mile-wide river falling 300 feet, it's about twice the height and more than twice the width of Niagara, falls into this very narrow trough. Now, the river's a river. It's got to continue downstream. And it does continue downstream, but the outlet from the trough is very, very narrow. It's less than 100 yards wide. And what you have then is this concentration of a colossal energy created by the fall of so much water into this narrow trough. And he explains the local name in the Salozi language, Mosi Watunya, the smoke that thunders. The smoke is the mist which rises in some cases in the high season, visible for 30 miles or so. The thunder is the overwhelming noise that this makes. It's deafening, the roar, particularly in the high seas. Now, I mentioned seas. The Zambezi drains savanna country. That means, as we observed last time, that it's draining countryside with seasonal rainfall. Now, what this means in turn is that the Zambezi is a seasonal river, and it changes radically. The falls is a completely different experience depending on the time of the year that you visited. At its peak, and it takes some time to fill up a system this big, but at its peak in, say, March or so, the cubic feet of water per second coming over that falls is approximately 30 times what it was in the previous November. So again, a very different experience depending on when you see it. I'd like to give a couple of impressions of the falls by old-time first observers. This is from a book called Zambezi River of Africa, put together by Mike Coppinger and Jumbo Williams. Mostly a book of photographs, but they've culled some very juicy reactions to the falls. As the authors of the book say, Mosi Watunya engenders emotion. It's not a passive experience. They quote a visitor from 1876. It seemed to me as if my own identity were swallowed up in the surrounding glory, the voice of which rolled on forever like the waves of eternity. No human being can describe the infinite, and what I saw was a part of infinity made visible and framed in beauty. As they say, it engenders emotion. Sometimes the emotions struck people in a rather different way. A visitor in 1898. It is hell itself, a corner of which seems to open at your feet, a dark and terrible hell from the middle of which you expect every moment to see some repulsive monster rising in anger. Now, I wouldn't share that reaction, but their point that it engenders reaction and response and emotion is certainly there. I would agree with them. The scale is massive, the spectacle spellbinding, and perpetually changing. Now, the only way to see the entire expanse of the falls, the whole mile-wide stretch, is from the air. And the only way to get in the air is by machine at this point. There are no high places around. I first did this in a terrifying journey in a four-seater single-engine plane. The last time I went, I truly bit the bullet and took a microlight flight over the falls, essentially a hang glider with a motor and a pilot, thank God. And finally, I think, was able to appreciate probably the most famous words ever written about this place. They came from David Livingstone, who was the first European to see it in 1855, and of course named it after his queen. As Livingstone put it, scenes so lovely must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight. Thank you.